Daniel Harris thought the battlefield was behind him. But the real war began the moment his own neighborhood turned against him. A decorated soldier who survived overseas missions. He came home to find his greatest enemy wasn't foreign, it was his homeowners association. What started as petty letters about fences and paint would unravel into a ruthless scheme to strip him of his home, expose a web of corruption, and test just how far one man could go to protect what was rightfully his. Daniel Harris returned from overseas service with one dream in his heart: to live quietly in the home he had bought years earlier with his savings and military pay. For him, the house was more than just a structure of wood and brick. It was a symbol of safety, something he had fought for, something he believed no one could take away. The neighborhood seemed calm, the streets lined with tidy lawns, and families who waved politely. After years of seeing chaos and danger abroad, the gentle rhythm of suburban life gave Daniel a sense of relief he had long craved. He thought he had finally reached the kind of peace he had always imagined. For months, everything appeared normal. He fixed small things around the house, planted flowers in the front yard, repaired his backyard fence with his own hands. Every detail gave him comfort, reminding him that he was finally in control of his life again. Yet small envelopes began appearing in his mailbox, tucked between the regular bills and advertisements. At first, he barely paid attention to them. They looked like ordinary reminders, the sort of neighborhood newsletters one might expect. But when he opened the first one, his stomach tightened. It accused him of violating homeowners' rules by having his fence slightly taller than allowed. Another letter followed, pointing out that his garden shed wasn't officially registered with the association. Then came a warning about the color of paint on his back porch, apparently not within the approved list. Daniel shook his head at the absurdity. He had fought through nights of fear overseas, only to come home and be lectured about the shade of paint on his porch. He decided to ignore it, thinking the notices would stop once they realized he was in compliance. After all, his fence wasn't unsafe, his shed hurt no one, and his paint color was just a quiet shade of gray. But ignoring the notices turned out to be his first mistake. The letters multiplied, each with harsher language. What started as polite reminders turned into accusations. They now included numbers, fines, late fees, and penalties that didn't make sense. Soon, the envelopes stopped being simple letters. They arrived in large, official-looking packages, stamped with warnings in bold black ink, amounts demanded. Grew larger, each notice adding layers of interest and administrative costs. Daniel tried to call the phone number listed, but no one answered. He left messages explaining that he didn't understand what they wanted from him, but days turned into weeks without a single callback. The silence on their end only made the threats in the letters feel louder. At night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with the letters spread out before him. His training had taught him how to prepare for ambushes and unexpected attacks, but nothing had prepared him for this. He was being boxed in by paperwork, by rules he had never agreed to, and by a group of people who refused to listen. He wondered if it was a clerical error, a mix-up that would be corrected with time. But as the notices piled higher, doubt crept into his mind. Was this intentional? Were they targeting him? What unsettled him most was how invisible the enemy was. In the military, he could see who he was up against, measure the danger, and plan his defense. Here, the threat came in the form of fine print, hidden clauses, and faceless officials who never returned his calls. He felt trapped in his own home, unsure of what would happen next. The yard that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a stage, every detail of it scrutinized by unseen eyes. Daniel didn't know it yet, but those small envelopes were only the beginning. The people behind them weren't interested in fences or paint colors. They wanted something much larger, something Daniel had no intention of giving up his home. And while he thought the problem would fade if he ignored it, the truth was far more dangerous. The notices were not warnings. They were the first shots in a new kind of battle, one that would threaten to take away everything he had fought so hard to protect. One crisp autumn morning, Daniel returned from a routine doctor's appointment and froze when he pulled into his driveway. A large wooden post had been hammered into his lawn, holding a glaring sign that read in bold red letters, Foreclosure pending property, seized by HOA. The words cut into him like a blade. He stood motionless, unable to process what he was seeing. His home, the one he had fought to keep safe, was being marked for removal as if he were a trespasser on his own land. The quiet street seemed louder than ever, every rustling leaf and barking dog echoing in his ears as shock sank into his chest. He rushed inside, hoping to find some mistake in the paperwork taped to his front door. Instead, the documents confirmed the nightmare. According to the HOA, Daniel owed thousands of dollars in unpaid fines, late penalties, and so-called legal fees. He felt his hands tremble as he read line after line of numbers that had ballooned out of control. His fence, his shed that paint each tiny detail had been transformed into a financial weapon aimed directly at him. What had started as a few $100s in fines had spiraled into a debt so large it seemed designed to crush him. The worst part was the claim that his property had been seized through a lien filed by the HOA. Daniel had never been summoned to court, never been given the chance to explain himself. And yet here in black and white, they declared that his house no longer fully belonged to him. He was stunned that such a thing could happen without warning. He had paid his mortgage faithfully, never missed a tax payment, and maintained his home with pride. How could a neighborhood board hold more power over his home than the bank or the government? As he stood in disbelief, his eyes drifted to the street. Neighbors had begun to notice the sign. Some lingered on their porches, whispering to one another. A few gave sympathetic looks, but most avoided his gaze, pretending to be busy with yard work or their children. The silence stung. These were people he had once trusted to watch over his house when he was deployed, people who had waved to him on summer evenings. Now they stood at a distance, unwilling to challenge the very association that ruled over them as well. The HOA's grip on the community was stronger than Daniel had realized. They decided who was in good standing, who was fined, and even who could use neighborhood amenities. Anyone who defied them risked becoming an outcast or, worse, the next target. Daniel understood then why no one was stepping forward to help. Fear had silenced them all. He sat in his living room, the foreclosure notice spread across the coffee table, trying to make sense of his new reality. Every part of him wanted to believe it was a clerical error, something that could be fixed with a few phone calls. But the bold red lettering on the sign outside told him otherwise. This was deliberate. Someone wanted him out. The HOA's timeline was brutal. The paperwork stated that unless he paid the full amount immediately, his home would be sold to the highest bidder at a public auction. The idea of strangers walking through his house, claiming ownership of his kitchen, his bedroom, his backyard, made him feel sick. He had fought enemies across the world, but this battle was happening in his own neighborhood, and it felt more suffocating than any mission he had ever faced. That night, sleep didn't come. He paced his home, the room suddenly feeling smaller, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. The thought of losing everything he had built weighed heavily on his chest. His medals, his photos, the garden he had carefully nurtured, all of it, could be stripped away in weeks, reduced to items in someone else's possession. Daniel knew then that he couldn't afford to stay passive. Ignoring the letters had nearly cost him his home. The HOA was playing a game of power and control, one designed to break people like him. He realized that he would need to uncover how they had gained such authority, and more importantly, who was behind it. The sign in his yard wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration of war. And this time, Daniel wasn't going to back down. Daniel knew that fighting the HOA would require more than frustration and late-night pacing. He needed evidence, and he needed to understand how they had managed to put him in this position without warning. The following morning, he began his own investigation. He started with the basics, combing through every letter, every document, every notice that had been delivered to his mailbox over the last year, spread across his dining table. The papers looked like a puzzle that had been scattered without instructions. But as he studied them closely, patterns began to appear. The same signatures repeated across different documents, the same initials marked the bottom of pages. What struck him was how impersonal it all seemed. Not one letter bore the name of a neighbor he knew, only titles and stamped signatures from people who never revealed themselves. He decided to take his search further. At the county clerk's office, he requested copies of the lien documents filed against his property. The clerk handed him a thin packet, but inside those pages, Daniel found something deeply unsettling. The board members of the HOA weren't longtime residents of the community, as he had assumed. Instead, their names traced back to a corporate entity registered in another state, a company specializing in property management and investment. They weren't just enforcing rules to protect neighborhood standards, they were using fines as a tool to push people into default. The more Daniel read, the clearer it became. This was not an isolated incident. Several addresses in the same neighborhood had liens filed against them in the last 3 years. A pattern emerged. A family fined for unapproved landscaping who later sold their home in a rush. Another house foreclosed after fines over a cracked driveway, and a retired couple who suddenly left without explanation.
What?
Each case ended with the property being resold quickly, usually through channels connected to the same corporate group that controlled the HOA. Daniel's chest tightened as he realized what was happening. This was a system carefully designed to strip homeowners of their property. The association was acting less like a neighborhood board and more like a predatory business. The signs were all there: inflated fines, legal loopholes, rushed foreclosures, and silent neighbors too afraid to resist.
Oh, yeah.
Hay had turned the very idea of community into a weapon. Back at home, Daniel gathered everything he had uncovered. The documents told a disturbing story, one that mirrored his own unfolding nightmare, where since he recalled the sympathetic looks from a few neighbors when the foreclosure sign appeared in his yard. Were they silent because they feared being next? Or had some already been forced out, their homes taken before anyone could notice? He realized then that this wasn't just about him. His house was simply the latest target in a chain of victims. Late into the night, Daniel scoured public records online. Tracing the company that operated the HOA, he found connections to real estate groups with histories of lawsuits in other states, cases that had been quietly settled out of court. Each lawsuit painted the same picture: homeowners claiming they had been pressured, fined into debt, and stripped of their houses. Some had lost everything. The realization hit him like a punch. His home was not just a random casualty of overly strict rules. It was part of a calculated strategy to profit off vulnerable people, hidden behind the respectable face of a homeowners association. The board had turned rules about fences and sheds into weapons of theft. As the weight of his discovery sank in, Daniel felt both anger and clarity. He had faced enemies who wore uniforms, carried weapons, and attacked in the open. But this was different. This was a shadow war, fought with papers, signatures, and manipulated laws. He understood now why the HOA had ignored his calls, why no one had come to his door to discuss the fines. They didn't want resolution. They wanted possession. Daniel stared at the piles of evidence spread before him, his mind racing. If they had done this to others, they could do it again. His fight was no longer just about saving his house. It was about exposing the truth, shining a light on the hidden machinery that thrived on fear and silence. For years he had fought battles overseas to protect freedom. Now, in the quiet of his own home, he realized he was about to fight another one against the very people who claimed to be protecting his neighborhood. And unlike the neighbors who had walked away in silence, Daniel had no intention of giving up. The weeks that followed became a blur of deadlines, paperwork, and mounting pressure. Daniel had uncovered the truth about who was pulling the strings. But exposing it and stopping them were two entirely different battles. The HOA wasn't slowing down. Every day brought a new letter, each one thicker than the last, layered with demands and threats. The language grew colder, the numbers more impossible. They had taken what was once a few thousand in fines and transformed it into a monstrous sum that no ordinary homeowner could ever repay. Daniel understood now that this was the tactic they crushed. Their targets with debts that could never realistically be settled. Ensuring foreclosure became the only outcome. When he contacted county officials, he ran into walls of bureaucracy. Clerks shrugged and directed him to different offices. each claiming that the HOA was a private entity with its own governing power. Lawyers he reached out to demanded retainers far higher than he could afford. The more he tried to navigate the system, the clearer it became. The HOA had built their scheme in a way that thrived on loopholes and the confusion of ordinary homeowners. It wasn't just corruption, it was clever corruption designed to make resistance feel futile. The pressure escalated beyond letters. One afternoon, Daniel noticed a black SUV parked down the street, stayed there for hours, its tinted windows hiding whoever sat inside. Days later, private security began making rounds through the neighborhood. They weren't the friendly patrols one might expect in a suburban community. Instead, they lingered near his home, watching, recording. Daniel could feel their eyes on him every time he stepped into his yard. It was intimidation, clear and calculated. They wanted him to feel like an outsider in the very place he had once called his sanctuary. His access to neighborhood amenities was stripped away as well. The community pool, gym, and clubhouse, all places he had paid dues to use, were suddenly off limits. Notices were taped to his door, declaring him in violation of membership standards. Even the simple act of walking to his mailbox became a moment of tension as neighbors averted their eyes, unwilling to risk being seen as sympathetic to him. Isolation was part of the strategy. They wanted him cornered, alone, and desperate enough to surrender. Then came the breaking point. A letter arrived by certified mail, stamped with urgency. Inside, it declared that his property would be placed for auction in less than 30 days. The date and time were listed as if it were already final. His home reduced to nothing more than an item to be sold to the highest bidder. He read the notice over and over, hoping to find some flaw in the wording, some loophole that might save him. But the message was clear. They were moving fast, determined to strip him of his house before he could mount any serious defense. The reality sank into his chest like a stone. He had spent years fighting battles overseas, surviving missions that pushed him to the edge, only to return and face a different kind of war one that threatened to erase everything he had built. Anger mixed with desperation, but underneath it all was a stubborn resolve. He had been trained never to quit, never to walk away from a fight when something worth protecting was at stake. This home was not just wood and concrete. It was his safe place, his hard-earned stability, and a symbol of his survival. In his desperation, Daniel began reaching out to anyone who might listen. He contacted veterans organizations, explaining what was happening. His emails were long and detailed, outlining the web of deceit he had uncovered, the harassment he was enduring, and the looming auction that threatened to take everything. At first, he wasn't sure anyone would respond. But then, small sparks of hope began to appear. A veteran support group forwarded his story to journalists, and soon he received a call from a local reporter, curious about his case. The presence of cameras in the neighborhood changed the atmosphere instantly. What had been a silent war, hidden behind letters and intimidation, was suddenly visible. Reporters filmed the foreclosure sign in his yard, interviewed neighbors who cautiously admitted they had seen similar things happen before, began asking the HOA for comments. The board, once faceless and unreachable, scrambled to push back, releasing carefully worded statements about rule enforcement and community standards. But Daniel knew they were rattled. Their control thrived in darkness, and now the spotlight was beginning to shine. For the first time in months, Daniel felt a shift. He wasn't just a lone homeowner fighting an impossible battle. His story had struck a chord. The public was watching, and the HOA's carefully built walls of silence were starting to crack. Still, the auction loomed dangerously close, and the question remained, would the exposure come soon enough to save his home? The day of the scheduled auction arrived like a storm cloud that had been slowly building for weeks. Daniel woke before dawn, unable to rest, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. His home, the place he had dreamed of returning to during long nights overseas, was hours away from being sold to strangers if nothing stopped it. Every creak of the house as he moved through it felt like a farewell, each photograph on the wall a reminder of what could be lost. He had fought battles across the globe, but the idea of losing his house in his own country at the hands of a neighborhood association cut deeper than any wound he had ever endured. But as the sun rose, the street outside looked different. Vans lined the curb, cameras pointing toward his home. Reporters gathered on the sidewalk, microphones ready. Word of his fight had spread far beyond the neighborhood, picked up by local outlets and shared across social media. Veterans groups had rallied, demanding answers, and families who had once suffered in silence began speaking out. Some had driven from nearby towns to stand by his side, holding signs that read "Protect Veterans' Homes" and "Stop HOA Abuse." The quiet street had become a stage, and for the first time, HOA could no longer operate in the shadows. That morning, Daniel's lawyer, someone who had agreed to represent him pro bono, after hearing his story on the news, filed an emergency motion in court. The documents included everything Daniel had uncovered: the corporate connections, the pattern of foreclosures, the inflated fines. The evidence painted a clear picture of predatory tactics disguised as neighborhood management. While Daniel waited, time seemed frozen. Neighbors peeked through blinds, some emboldened by the crowd, others still too afraid to take sides. He could see the nervous movements of HOA representatives at the end of the street, avoiding cameras, whispering to each other as though the control they had enjoyed for years was slipping from their grasp. Minutes before the scheduled auction was to begin, news broke. A judge had granted a temporary injunction, halting the sale of his property. The order demanded that no transfer of ownership could occur until a full investigation was completed. Relief crashed over Daniel like a wave. For the first time since the ordeal began, his home was safe, at least for now. The foreclosure sign was pulled from his yard that afternoon, leaving behind a patch of torn grass, but restoring something far more important: his dignity. The investigation that followed pulled back the curtain on years of corruption. Records showed how the HOA board had been quietly replaced by corporate investors with no ties to the community. Men and women who treated family homes like inventory. Their scheme was simple yet devastating. Target minor violations, stack up. Fines bury homeowners in debt, then swoop in and claim properties at bargain prices. Once exposed, their actions could no longer be hidden behind legal jargon and intimidating letters. Families who had once been forced out began sharing their experiences publicly. Each story echoing Daniel's, each one another nail in the coffin. Of the HOA's credibility, for Daniel, victory was bittersweet. He kept his home, but the battle had taken its toll. Months of stress had worn him down, and the neighborhood that once felt welcoming now seemed tainted by betrayal. Even so, his persistence had sparked change. Lawmakers began discussing reforms to limit the powers of HOAs, with special protections for veterans and elderly homeowners. Journalists called his case a turning point, the moment that shifted public attention onto the unchecked authority of associations that had, for too long, operated without oversight. Daniel never sought recognition. He wanted only peace, a place to heal, and build a quiet life. Instead, he became a symbol of resistance, a man who refused to let greed and intimidation strip him of what he had earned. His fight sent ripples far beyond his street, reminding countless others that even in the safety of suburban neighborhoods, danger could hide in contracts and fine print rather than shadows and violence. On the evening after the injunction, Daniel sat on his porch as the cameras packed up and the crowd dispersed. The house behind him still stood, battered by months of fear, but unbroken, much like himself. The yard was quiet again, the air cool, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to breathe deeply. He knew the battle wasn't fully over. Investigations take time, and the HOA's tactics wouldn't disappear overnight. But he had won the first and most important fight. His home remained his, and with that victory came a sense of strength he thought he had lost. Daniel Harris was no longer just a soldier returning home. He was a defender of it, not just for himself, but for every homeowner who might one day face the same kind of invisible war.